This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Welcome. Welcome to the Research Commons. This may be the first time some of you have been in this space, which is really a space to support Emory faculty and students working together to apply new technologies and new techniques in their work and research. So delighted to see you today. Rushdie's digital computers in MARBL really sparked, in many ways, they fired up our imagination relative to this intersection of a change in media and format and how that might be used in the context of special collections and where that might take us in terms of both the curatorial responsibilities and then thinking about how that will support research and scholarship over time. Firing up that imagination in many ways led to this space here, where we tried to kind of reconceive how a laboratory, in many ways brought together with human expertise, technology, new methods of research, how all that might work in a very experimental space, and which led to this Research Commons, which really is, in many ways, is kind of something new that we're trying to bring to the Emory community. So delighted to have you join us here, and we look forward to continuing to engage you in this experimental space as we all move forward. Welcome also to today's event, which we see as it will be a lively conversation. And it's the first of many conversations where we will try to extract and really talk about this intersection of digital materials in MARBL, digital scholarship, and how those things can come together in some new and different ways. I'd like to briefly introduce our speakers. Sir Salman Rushdie is beginning his second appointment, his second 5-year appointment here at Emory University as University Distinguished Professor. And he has entrusted our manuscripts, archives, and rare book library with his archives. And in doing so, again, not only fired up imagination about that collection, but I think in many ways has fired up the university community in terms of thinking about different ways that we might work together. Erika Farr is our digital archives coordinator in MARBL, and she has been involved with the Rushdie collection and specifically with Rushdie computers since their arrival, and has been a real pioneer in terms of trying to push the envelope and sort of convene this conversation and this work to support how we will curate this collection. In terms of the program today, Erika will talk with Salman about how computers and other technology affect his writing and creative process, and they'll be also discussing the writing of his recently completed memoir and the use of his own archive here at Emory. So with that, they will have a dialogue, and then at some point we'll turn that over to a Q&A session. So thank you for joining me again.
Thank you. So given our location, both in the Woodruff Library and here in the Research Commons, which is in many ways about the intersections of research and archives and literary production, I thought, as Rick explained, we could sort of focus our talk really on those kinds of intersections, between personal papers and literary archives and the cultural record. Given that you bravely gave us almost your entire digital life with that set of computers that you gave us back mid-2000s, I think it's interesting to ponder how shifts in technology, and you have, as an author writing over the years that you've been writing, have survived / benefited from quite a few shifts. Mm-hmm. How that has impacted your craft as an author.
Well, just to begin at the end, one of the things I think that we both learned about from these old computers is, people think paper perishable, right, electronic material eternal, whereas actually the electronic material was harder to deal with than the paper. That's right. Because it's changed so much. Who uses floppy disks? And just the business of excavating information from these old computers, mm-hmm, was a lot harder than opening a box full of papers. So oddly, it was the opposite of what you'd expect. Right. that the old technology stuff, handwritten and typed material, was actually much easier to process than the supposedly easier stuff.
The newer.
The newer stuff. And I have this little joke about how books are actually this very radical form of information storage system, you know, that you can drop water on them and they do not lose their data. You know? Speaking as somebody who once destroyed a computer by pouring a Coke over it. You know, you pour a Coke over a book, all the information is saved. There's all kinds of things you could do with books. You know, you could read them in the bath. Probably not a good idea to take your laptop there, you know, and etc. There's a whole range of ways you can, you know, utilize this data, which is much more sophisticated than anything you get electronically. So I'm not sure it's ever going away entirely, that written,
the book.
The written form,
right.
You know. And for me, I mean, I was never somebody who wrote books longhand. You know, I mean, I always typed. But what I would do, and I mean, in a way still do, is to use notebooks for a lot of preparatory work. You know, that when I didn't know fully what the idea was, and I was just working out the idea and the characters and so on, I would scribble in notebooks. And that
hasn't changed with mobile devices?
That hasn't really changed, except it has changed to a degree in that I now also have like a notebook file on my computer, so I can either jot things down there or in notebooks, but I mean sort of randomly. But I use both processes now. But in the old days, I used to always type, and that's one way in which shifting to computers really made life a lot easier, because, I mean, like many writers, I have a fetish about clean pages. You know, I don't like showing people pages with lots of Xings out and so on. I mean, I remember this years and years ago, long before computers, the age before computers, BC. I did an event with the British novelist Fay Weldon somewhere in London, and the question from the audience was about this. A woman said, you know, when you're typing, because we both had said that we typed, she said, when you write something you don't like, do you exit out and go on, or do you take the piece of paper out of the typewriter and put a new piece of paper in? And everybody in the audience laughed because they thought it was a silly question, except for Fay and I, who both said that we took the piece of paper out of the typewriter and put a new piece of paper in. And it's because of that dislike of having a messed up page. You know, I think a lot of writers want to be able to see a page that looks like a page. And they want to be able to show a page that looks like a page. Which meant that there's always a lot of really arduous retyping that was involved. And the problem with that is it actually takes up so much time that it reduces the time available for the actual work.
The creative
you know?
process.
And so when I finally got my first computer in sort of early 90s somewhere, I had a lot of worries people had about moving to computers in those days was that it would change your writing in some way. You know, a lot of people said it would make your writing less disciplined. You know, you would just be, because you could just blurt everything out. There would just be a lot of blurt.
Right.
Which is true on a lot of the internet, but you know, where everybody thinks that because they can write, they should. I found the opposite to be true. You know, I found that because of the ease of revision, and because the ease of cleaning up the page, you know, that didn't take nearly so much time. And so it left a lot more time available for the actual work. You know, and it probably meant that you revised more.
Right.
Just because you could.
Continuously.
Yeah, there's a point when you've typed the same page out 5 or 6 times and you just think, the hell with it, you know, I'm just going to write the next page. So, but the fact that here you could just endlessly improve, you know, made me more willing to do that. You know? So I think actually, in the end, it was beneficial to the finished product, because it just I probably went over it 5 or 6 times more than I would on a typed page.
Now, so that really effectively, and thank you, helpfully describes how sort of the idea of going from typewriter to computer in some ways freed you from the sort of mechanical aspects of writing. What about the research components that technology brings in? So all of a sudden, you're sitting somewhere that not only has an application that allows you to type, so to speak, but also
to find things out.
Did that change your
Yes, it did
process?
a lot, actually. I mean, well, it actually did a lot once I was here and had the keys that give you access to the academic internet,
okay.
because the problem with the internet is enormous breadth and very little depth.
Right.
And also, anybody who's ever used Wikipedia knows that you don't trust it.
Right.
I mean, my Wikipedia page, I think, says that I'm an only child. In fact, I have 3 sisters. And it doesn't matter how often you go and change it, somebody goes and changes it back. So I think anybody who's ever engaged with that knows that you've got to double check material that's on Wikipedia. So, I mean, it's useful, but it's not reliable.
Right.
But once I was able to get into the kind of academic internet, that was just colossally valuable. I mean, I remember, because then it adds depth.
Right.
Then you've got the depth as well as the breadth. I mean, I remember when I was working on The Enchantress of Florence, for instance, because that's a historical novel, so it requires a lot of, it required a lot of looking into old texts.
Right.
I mean, not just books about the past, but actually original documents. And the part of the novel that's set in the reign of the Emperor Akbar in the 16th century in India, there are basically 2 contemporary sources, very large books that were written more or less throughout his reign on an almost daily basis. There's a book called the Akbarnama, which is sort of more or less day-by-day history of his reign. And then there's another book called the Ain-e-Akbari, which has to do with his lawmaking, and that's again an enormous multi-volume work talking about the governance of the empire in that time. These are books which are written in Farsi, which was the court language of the time, which I don't speak. And there are translations available, quite good ones. And in the old days, you would go to, some dusty shelf of the whatever library happened to be nearest, and you would get these huge old volumes, and then you'd have to look through multiple volumes of very small print in order to try and find useful stuff. Now, there are websites which have this up as parallel text in Farsi and English, with the miracle of the search engine. So that you could put a search term in and find out everything you need, really fast. So just in that case of being able to look at the 2 definitive documents of the reign of Akbar, it probably saved me months and months of work.
Right.
Months and months of work of having to be in a library rummaging for that material. So that was a real eye-opener to me. I mean, that was the first time I think that I'd used the internet to that level. I mean, and again, for instance, in the other part of that novel, which is set in Renaissance Italy, there's a scene, it's only a couple of pages long, which takes place at the home of the great condottiere, the kind of mercenary military leader of Genoa, Andrea Doria, name afterwards given to a ship that sank. But Andrea Doria was the great naval leader of Genoa, and he had a very lavish home right on the edge of the sea. It's still there actually. You can go and visit if you're in Genoa. But I wanted to know but the home has had additions over the centuries, like after him, and I wanted to know about what it was like when it was his house, because I wanted to put a scene in that house with him in it, and I wanted to know what his house was like. So you go in, go dive into this stuff, and there was this extraordinary, I found this essay which had floor plans and photographs of what was on the walls, and etc. And I mean, it was just extraordinary. It was 10 times as much as I needed, But that's good, because then you feel, okay, I've got all of that, but I only need a little of it, And so there were all kinds of moments like that where being able to have access to that kind of scholarship was really useful. I mean, of course, it's useful on the much more trivial level if you want to check dates and things.
Right.
You know, and or check quotations, things like that. And one of the things I've learned the hard way is that when you make a mistake about a quotation, it's always because you think you know it. Always. You know, when you're not sure, you look it up, you get it right.
Right.
When you think, no, I know that, you write it down, you're always wrong. You're always wrong. So, and so that, I mean, that is relative, especially with literary quotations and so on, you know, they're relatively easy to check on. And yeah, it just, you know, it means you can do some of your own fact checking.
Right.
You know, I mean, any of us who've published in the New Yorker know what happens to your text when it goes into the New Yorker machine. And it's often fabulously irritating, you know. And then afterwards, you're always sort of grateful for it, because they usually save you from 2 or 3 real howlers, you know, and that you would be embarrassed to see in the text. So in the end, you think, but while they're doing it, it's beyond annoying. I mean,
Well, as it happens, there are records of that fabulous irritation in your digital archive. We have some really nice
interchange. Actually, the worst one was they fact-check fiction. You know? I mean, that's when it really gets crazy. And I remember I had a story that was in the New Yorker, in which there was it's about a woman having an arranged marriage, a woman in Pakistan having an arranged marriage to somebody in England who she'd never met, and was a much older man, and she didn't want to get married to him, and there's sort of problem. The older man in England doesn't appear in the story. You know, he's simply named, but he's the man she doesn't want to marry who's over there, right? And he's not really characterized at all in the story. All you know about him is that he's old, and she doesn't want to marry him. But his name is given, right? So the New Yorker fact checkers, and he's supposed to live in the city of Bradford in Yorkshire, the north of England. So the New Yorker fact checkers got the Bradford, Yorkshire telephone directories and looked through to see if there were people with that name. And they found 5 people with the same last name, 3 of whom gave their first name as being the same as the character in the story, and the other 2 just had initials. So they started phoning them. So they call them all up and sort of clear it, you know, with 4 of the 5. The 5th one doesn't answer the phone, right? And I don't know, maybe he moved house, whatever, but he doesn't answer the phone. And the copy deadline is coming for the magazine. And so they say, well, we haven't been able to reach this 5th person, so you need to change the name. And what's more, they said, since this is again, pre-electronic, this is old-fashioned, hot type. This is types, big metal type setting. And they say, well, since, the story is kind of set, you need to change the name to another name of the same length. This is
Sounds like a word game of some sort.
I mean, this is the point at which you call your literary agent. I thought this is what Andrew Wiley's for. So I called him up and I said, Andrew, this is kind of nuts, and can you do something? And he said, yeah, leave it with me. And he called me back 5 minutes later and he said, it's fine. You don't have to do it. I thought, really? And he said, yeah, it's fine. I said, well, what do you do? Because they were really insisting with me that I should do it. And he used a line out of The Godfather. He said, I reasoned with them.
Well done.
So sometimes, but I mean, so sometimes it's annoying, that stuff. But as I say, the internet does let you do a bit of it for yourself.
Nice.
And it reduces that amount of stuff.
That chatter. So, as I mentioned earlier, you bravely gave us all of the
maybe
all the
more
machines.
bravely than I thought.
All the machines that you had, as well as your paper archive. And I think that for those of us who work in an academic library and work in a special collections library, it's fascinating to sort of think what that feels like for you to have sort of handed over your personal.
Well, it feels very weird, is what it feels like. But I think, as I say, at the time that I did it, I didn't fully understand
what you were doing.
What I was doing, yeah. And then, I came here, last year there was that exhibition up of all the stuff from the archive, and it made me want to hide behind the furniture. You know, I thought, really? You got that?
Supersized.
You know, supersized, these sort of doodles. I mean, that was the worst bit, I think. Everybody sort of does various kinds of doodles and drawings, you know. You don't expect them to be blown up and framed and hung on a wall.
Captions.
Yeah, that was bad. But it does feel a little bit like undressing in public. But I think the reason it wasn't too awful was the fact that we had done so much work before on, I mean, the biggest, as you know, the biggest thing that we had to talk about was privacy.
Right.
And probably for, you know, I think 3/4 of the conversation that we had about the archive before it was placed here had to do with those kinds of issues. Because, of course, it's my privacy, but it's not only my privacy. You know, it's a lot of other people's privacy. And your family and friends talk to you in a certain way because they're your family and friends, you know, and they don't expect that material is going to be available for the rest of the world to have a look at. So it was very important to respect that, you know, and you know, people I've had relationships with or been married to or whatever, you know, it just didn't seem at all appropriate that their conversations with me should suddenly be exposed to public scrutiny.
Right.
And so we had to go through all this massive, both paper and electronic material in order to create a kind of embargoed body of material. Some of which is embargoed, you know, in my lifetime, because if it's only about me and I'm dead, I don't care. But some of which is embargoed in the lifetime of the people involved, my children or whatever, you know. And I think that's fair. And I think once we had gone through that we're still going through it.
Yep.
We just did it this morning. You know, once we'd gone through that, then I felt, okay, it's not going to embarrass me, but more importantly, it's not going to embarrass anyone else. You know, people write to you about their illnesses, their quarrels with their parents, their marital situation, their, you know, whatever, their professional situation, their worries about their work, or etc. That's the way in which your friends and family talk to you. That's not for anyone else's ears, you know, other than me.
Right.
And so that was my main worry, really. Once we were talking about placing the archive here, I thought, well, that's the question we have to solve. And if we can solve that properly, then yeah, it's still a bit cringe-making, but it's not embarrassing to a whole range of people who have every reason to expect that I would respect their privacy.
Yeah.
You know.
So, you know, the cringe-making and the embarrassment and the work to avoid those things, it's quite a big barrier. So why is it important to have your papers in a public record?
Truthfully, it wasn't important until it was suggested to me. I mean, I had literally never thought about it, never. And then I came here to, whatever it was like 8 years ago, to do the Ellman lectures.
Yeah.
It was the first time I'd ever been at Emory, first time I'd ever been, you know, in Atlanta. And somewhere during that period of 4 or 5 days, I guess, that I was here, President Wagner said to me, had I ever thought about what to do with my archives? And I said, you know, truthfully, I have never thought about it. Because, you know, I'm not 100 years old, and, you know, or dead. And it doesn't seem to me, I mean, why would I think about it?
Right.
You know? And he said, well, would you think about it? And I said, okay. You know, and I mean, and that was the beginning of the conversation. Took the next couple of years, I think, you know, before we resolved all these issues.
Yeah.
So it's just somebody asked, you know, it was as simple as that. I mean, nobody had ever asked before. And there's this funny, I have a lot of friends at Columbia, and they got really put out. They said, really, Emory? You know, why? And I said, well, did you ever ask? Did you ever mention it? You know, in that case, don't complain.
Your loss.
You know, yeah, you just dropped the ball. So, yeah, I mean, truthfully, it had not been. But then once Jim Wagner did suggest that I thought about it, and I did start thinking about it, I thought, well, you know, I've got all this stuff in cardboard boxes in the attic, and it's kind of spilling out of the attic, and I'm having to rent this kind of storage facility to put this stuff, and it's not safe in a way. You know,
Right.
you worry about not just about, I mean, fire damage, yes, but even more dangerous than fire damage is water damage. You know, and that's true for an electronic archive.
That's right.
You know, even more than a paper archive, as we were saying. So I thought this stuff is just sitting there, you know, and it may as well be somewhere where it's safe. You know, so that was also a factor. And also it was in a complete mess, you know. I mean, the paper archive, I mean, I just did have a cardboard box by my desk, and I just threw it. Somebody, I wish I could remember who it was. Somebody said to me back in the late 70s, because I didn't used to keep anything, you know, I would just crumple things up into balls and throw them in the trash, sheets of paper. Somebody said to me, don't do that. Just have a cardboard box next to your desk, and instead of throwing it in the waste paper basket, throw it in the cardboard box, and one day it'll pay off your mortgage. I mean, that's more or less exactly what happened. So basically there had been no attempt to organize this material at all.
Right.
I mean, I was just like, except chronologically, you know, from the bottom of the box upwards.
Organic chronology.
Yeah, it was just going in like that. And then when the box was full, I'd get another box and put that box in the attic. You know? So there was this, I don't know, whatever it was, 100 boxes, you know, of everything. I mean, I didn't even know what was in there. And much, I mean, when we were beginning this business of looking, even before you started your work here, when we were just looking through it in London, I found things I didn't know were there, you know. I mean, I found early drafts of books, and I found a few short stories that I'd forgotten that I wrote, and just a whole pile of, you know, photographic and other material that I had no idea was in there. So it was, I mean, it became very interesting.
So you're having your papers here and getting them processed and preserved and ready for access corresponded with your preparing to write your memoir. And I wonder what sort of synchronicity happened there that...
Well, I think it actually allowed me to write the memoir, truthfully, because I mean, you know, people have been asking me for a very long time if I was ever going to write that book, and truthfully, there were two reasons why I didn't. One is that I just didn't feel ready to write it, and the other is that all this information was in such a mess, you know, and you know, if it hadn't been for you guys, I'd have had to sort it out, and I mean, truthfully, I would just simply never have done it, you know, and so that means I wouldn't have been able to write certainly the kind of very detailed. Oh, this is a long book; it's like over 600 pages. I certainly wouldn't have been able to do that.
Right.
You know, I might have been able to write some shorter text just out of memory and what notes I had, but I wouldn't have been able to do this without having this material organized. You know? So there was this moment, whatever it was, 2.5 years ago, when the paper archive was done, really, and I get this, you know, this file which is like the master index. And there's, you know, my life with barcodes, you know, every laundry list with a barcode next to it, you know. And so I was then able to just say, I'd like this, 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 and this. And boom, there it is, you know, photocopied, neatly filed. And it made me think, oh, well, now I could write that book. You know, I mean, now it's actually become possible to write that book because the material is so organized.
Nice.
And the fact that it became possible to write the book encouraged me to write the book. You know, I thought, okay, well, time to do it maybe, you know. So I think it's quite direct, it's a linear connection that the work that was done here resulted in my writing that book. And had it not been done here, I wouldn't have been able to do it.
Okay. You were talking yesterday afternoon in the chat you had with Dean Foreman about your training as a history student and the sort of methodology you learned working with primary materials. What's it like turning that methodology onto sort of your own primary record?
Well, I mean, the big difference is that you also have memory. You know, which when you're looking at history, you obviously you don't. You know, you only have the record.
Right.
In this case, the primary record. I mean, yes, there were you know, I had all these journals and diaries and notebooks from the period of, you know, after the Socratic Verses was published, which gave me a lot of stuff. And some of that stuff I could just lift out and use, I mean, not exactly as it was, but more or less as it was in my notes. More often, those notes were just a trigger to memory. You know, more often when I was looking at those things, I thought, oh yeah, now I remember that happened, you know, and it just gave me a way into writing about it. So it's not exactly the same as historical research because because actually you lived through it, you know. And when I have a good memory, but nobody has that good a memory, you know. But what you do have is the memory does respond to triggers. You know, so as long as you have the material there to prompt it, you know, it's quite surprising how much does come back under that kind of prompting. That was really, I thought, I mean, as I say, there are passages from all the material that I got photocopied out of here. There are passages which I just thought, well, I mean, that's kind of more or less exactly what I do want to say, so I could just use that. But more often it was a basis for doing the writing.
Right. Well, thank you so much. So we wanted to have a chance to sort of explore some high-level themes like we just did, but we also wanted to turn it over to all of you and spend an equal amount of time in conversation with the staff, faculty, and students here at Emory. So we'd like to invite questions. Is there a mic? Yeah, there we go.
There it is.
Yeah, I had a question from the very first thing that you said
Yeah.
about the difference in the preservation of digital and analog record, and who uses a floppy disk anymore. Well, assuming that we don't extinct ourselves in the next several millennia, someone may be looking back at all of this electronic record and saying, who uses that anymore? Has our experience with ancient texts and other discoveries of written record made you, or really perhaps more accurately the archivist, want to preserve a written record as separate, or do you have some great faith that the digital and other types of technology will continue to morph into other forms?
So
You want to print everything out?
yeah, right, which we call in our field the atomic backup. Yeah, I think, it's a great question, and our field in archives and academic libraries are pursuing it in consort with computer scientists and other technologists. And I think there's a classic concept in archives called benign neglect, which means for paper materials, largely if you just leave it in your attic in a cardboard box, it'll be okay. That doesn't apply with digital archives and digital material. So we can't just count on the technology morphing, like you were saying. We have to be very aggressive and attentive, and we have to have a plan for migrating and both. And there's two big paths: migration and emulation. We're using both actually with Salman's digital archive, and it is a dynamic and attentive process. We have to maintain very close auditing and monitoring of the media and be aware of the field at large, the technological field at large. The problem with atomic backup as a sort of baseline solution is that increasingly you're going to have digital material that you want to archive that doesn't have an atomic option. How do you create an effective replica of say, graphic or 3D media that's part of a collection? That's not always an option, so we have to pursue technological-based solutions.
There was some of the printed out material that almost got lost in some cases was the problem of the fax, which is often on coated paper, and the material is not there forever. It starts to fade, and there was a whole bunch of material that we found which was almost invisible, and we had to re-photocopy it, in order to try and preserve it. And again, you think about here's a fax, here's something on a piece of paper. You think there it is. Put it in a file, it'll be all right. But no, it starts vanishing.
Well, and the fax is a great example because the paper versions of the faxes were problematic because it was on poor quality paper and bad ink. And on the first machine that we processed of yours, the digital copy of the faxes were problematic because when we booted up the machine, the fax software was corrupt. The application that you used to create your faxes was corrupted, and so we had to go through quite a sort of set of machinations to convert the fax files that would not be opened even in your computer, the actual machine that you gave us, into an image that can be viewed. So the faxes are actually problematic in various media, but we got them. We got them, and they're a really important artifact of both the technological moment that you were producing them and your own literary and personal circumstances that led you to rely on fax.
Well, the fax is a little tragic story of how technology arrives and disappears, I mean, I can remember when somebody said to me, you should get this thing called a fax machine. And I said, well, why would I get that? Because I don't know anyone else who has one, so I've got there's nobody to send a fax to, or to get one from. And then, 5 minutes later, everybody had fax machines. Right. And then we were all using them, and now nobody has fax machines, or almost nobody. So here's a technology that has sort of arrived, changed the world, died, within the space of 20 years.
Yeah, when we were reviewing email, some of your correspondence last Friday, we were talking about things that need to be redacted, like phone numbers and addresses, and there were all these fax numbers. And we were kind of laughing, like, do we need to redact the fax numbers? Does anyone have those anymore?
Yeah, exactly.
So another question, Tim?
I wanted to ask you about your attention span.
My what, sir?
Attention span.
Oh, yeah.
Because there have been arguments about digital scholarship, that the use of digital technology in teaching and learning and doing scholarship, that the internet prevents you from developing a sustained power of attention. And that it interferes with your ability to develop or follow long argument, or develop long stories, perhaps in literature. So I'm just wondering if, in your experience, you find that to have been a challenge or a threat to your.
No, I mean, I think I'm too old. I mean, I think my habits of attention were formed in another time, and I do think one of the things about being a writer is that, I mean, it's true of almost every writer I know, is that they develop over time really quite preternatural powers of concentration, just because it's what you need to have in order to do the work. You need to be able to go so deeply into the work that the world goes away. And I find, and many other writers I know find, that that the passage of time becomes odd. Quite often you think you've been sitting there for a couple of hours, and then you look at the clock and it's actually been 7 or 8 hours, and that, I mean, I think it's the ones, because I wasn't necessarily always like that, before I became a professional writer. I don't think I had that kind of force of concentration. I think it's one of the things that you learn by doing it, and having now done it for so long, for well over 30 years, I think the one thing I do have is quite strong powers of concentration. And actually, they're now so strong that I can even interrupt and go straight back in. I know it's that if the phone rings, I can take the call and do whatever it is, put it down, and go straight back. So no, I mean, I've not found that, but I think, as I say, you're asking the wrong guy. You should ask somebody even less than half my age, and maybe that is a problem. I don't know, but I'm just saying for me, not so really.
Well, with concentration in new media, you when you first joined Twitter, you were publishing that short story in tweets.
Yeah.
I mean, is that a different kind of concentration?
Well, I just got bored of doing it, actually. In the end, I just put the whole thing up at the same time.
Right, yeah.
It's 140 characters. It's really not long
It
enough,
isn't.
And the Twitter thing, I mean, I don't even know that I'm going to stay there for, forever. I mean, what happened is that I had a particular friend of mine who kept saying I should do it. And I said, no, come on, it's just nonsense. And she said, no, you do it. You just do it and you'll see. Just do it. And she was really right. She said, do it, just do it. So, and then as it happened, I came to the end of a very big piece of work, which was this memoir. And at the same time, I was coming near the end of another very big piece of work, which was my work on the Midnight Children film. And so I was suddenly less beset by work. I just had a little bit more time to spare, I guess. And so I thought, okay, see what happens. So I signed up, And first of all, it was very surprising and kind of flattering that this enormous number of people came rushing, you know, across, and that makes you think, okay, well, you know, if there's that many people interested, let me think of something to say to them, you know. And I do think that you have to have a strategy of Twitter. You know, you can't, and the thing that I can't stand is that, you know, now I'm turning left, you know, now I'm eating pizza. You know, that I think is just, you know, I think get a life, you know.
Yeah. And don't publicize it so much.
Yeah, exactly. We don't need to know, you know, what you're doing at every particular moment of the day. So I thought really that kind of trivia needs to be kept out of it, and you use it to talk about things you're interested in. I mean, whether it's something in the news that day, or whether it's something you're doing that actually is interesting, you know, or that you think might be interesting to other people than yourself. And I think that's the way I've tried to use it. And I mean, you know, I mean, it is kind of, I mean, I don't have the kind of number of followers that people who really have large numbers of followers have. You know, I mean, it's not up there in the Justin Bieber, Kim Kardashian.
But aren't you glad?
And, you know, 10 million people thing. And I mean, even amongst writers, I mean, I know, I mean, Neil Gaiman is a very good friend of mine. You go to Neil Gaiman's Twitter, he's got 1.6 million people.
Wow.
I mean, Stephen Fry has something like that, 1.5 million or something. Oh no, I think maybe he has 3.5 million. I don't know, it's something ridiculous. And to me, I mean, it's, I don't know, it's pushing 250,000 now, it's like 230,000, something like that, which feels like, and of course then you don't know who they are, because the other thing about Twitter is that everyone's anonymous.
Right.
You know, I mean, like 80% of the names, maybe 90% of the names are made up.
Right.
And so there is an app which I found which will geographically locate where your followers are, except of course those followers who have withheld that information. You know, so there's about, I would say, a quarter to a third of people who don't want you to know where they're based, but you assume that they will be distributed in the same distribution as the ones who do tell you. You know, so
sampling.
the same, yeah. This is what those of us who study gravity's rainbow know is called a Poisson distribution. And I, you know, so I did that, and I discovered, I mean, sort of what you would expect was true, that there's a lot of followers in and around New York City, there's a lot of followers in and around London, and there's a lot of followers in India. And that accounts for most of them, you know, and then there's smatterings, you know, scattered numbers elsewhere. And I thought that's sort of interesting, but it's what I'd expect anyway, because the parts of the world where you have most connection, you would expect that those parts of the world feel the most connection to you as well. So, I mean, it's interesting.
Yeah.
It's interesting up to a point.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I can still see that if I get, as I'm now beginning to get immersed into another big piece of work, that I'm going to do it less.
Yeah.
You know, because I'll be concentrating on something else. You know? But it's, I mean, I wouldn't say it's not been fun. It's been fun, and I mean sometimes it's nice to share stuff with people. I mean, like we were talking about my ridiculous weekend last weekend when
You were soliciting. Were you soliciting lyrics?
Well, what happened is that I was. This was a Penn New England. Have started this year giving an award for song lyrics of literary excellence, and the first two honorees were Leonard Cohen and Chuck Berry, and I had to present Leonard Cohen with it. I had to present Leonard Cohen with his prize.
It's a hard job.
Yeah, tough job. Somebody's got to do it, you know. And I mean, it was an extraordinary event because as well as Leonard Cohen and Chuck Berry, there was Paul Simon, who was going to give Chuck Berry his award, and Elvis Costello was going to play, and Keith Richards showed up, and I mean, it was kind of extraordinary. And the day before I went, I thought, okay, let me just ask. And I just put on Twitter, I asked people to send me their favorite Leonard Cohen lines, you know, and really hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people replied. I mean, many, many hundreds of people. And it wasn't all the same line, you know, I mean, it was, and what it showed was how much of his work had affected how many people. And, you know, and given that Twitter is obviously skewed quite young, you know, here's this 77-year-old dude you know, kids all love him, you know, and they were all saying, this is the best, that's great, this meant so much to me, that, you know, and it was really interesting and valuable, you know, to have that response.
Yeah.
So I think there are some times where you can use it in a way that's genuinely interesting, you know.
Another question, Brian?
So this is actually a question from Twitter.
Oh, you've been live blogging it over there?
We may have. So this is coming from the digital humanities librarian at Brown University, Jean Bauer. She wants to know if working with someone else to organize your archive changed how you thought about your evolution as a writer.
Well, the truth is, when you are just having your life, you know, I certainly, for me, I don't spend a great deal of my time looking backwards. You know, I mean, I'm more interested in looking in the opposite direction. You know, I'm more interested in next business than old stuff. I don't go back and read my old books that much. I don't really dig into the archive of the past that much. I mean, who cares, you know? In many ways, as you grow older, you feel different than your younger selves anyway. You feel that you've changed, including artistically changed. You know, that your concerns, what you're thinking about as a writer, what you want to explore linguistically, thematically, etc., changes. It's not the same now as it was when I was writing Midnight's Children. You know, so the thing it did by being you know, diving back. I mean, I haven't gone back into it in anything like the depth that Erika and her colleagues have. You know, but it does show. It gives you snapshots of an earlier self. That's what it does. You know, and it makes you see. Oh, I thought that then. You know, which in many cases. You also, what's followed by the thought, I don't think that anymore. and sometimes your younger self seems smarter than you and sometimes seems stupider than you. And very often it just seems other than you. You know, and so I think that's, in a way, that was the thing that this archival process showed me. It showed me, in fact, how much we change. You know, I mean, given that the earliest moments of these archives would go back to the mid-70s, you know, maybe 1972, 73, something like that would be the earliest stuff. I mean, that's 40 years of stuff, you know, and the person I was at 25 is a very different individual, you know, than this one. And that's sort of interesting. I mean, it's interesting up to a point, and then I don't care, and because you know, because really, I'm still, my instinct is not to look that way. You know, I mean, I'm happy. When I say happy, let's put that in inverted commas. I'm happy that other people are able to study this material, but I don't really need to, you know, because I'm in the business of making stuff. You know, and you don't want to be, in a way, too burdened by your past. Also, you forget. Yeah, sometimes it's useful to forget. You know, there's a whole burden you don't need to carry around with you. And I mean, I have a pretty good memory, in fact, but I've come to think of forgetting as a useful winnowing process. You know, I mean, I find that I don't remember what I don't need to remember, which includes people, by the way. So, I mean, if I meet somebody and I'm interested, etc., I always remember who they are. You know, and if I'm not interested, then who cares? You know, so that's memory. In fact, is a way of telling you what's important to you. You know, that you remember what's important to you, and the rest of it, poof. You know, and I think that about the archive. I mean, I think that's, yes, it's kind of, it's nostalgic for me, and it's interesting. And as I say, in the specific case of the memoir, because there I am trying to go back and recreate an autobiography. You know, I mean, in that case, it was absolutely essential. You know, but now that I've done that,
All done.
I don't see myself ever going so exhaustively into the archive again. You know, because it's, for me, served its purpose.
Another question way in the back? just get the,
This is a little bit of a follow-up question to that, but I wanted to ask about in the writing of the memoir if the archive made you remember differently, or kind of events that you had remembered a certain way to think about them differently.
Yeah, and I mean, actually it did all the time. I mean, because one of the most frequent errors of memory is that it collapses time. That things that actually, like there's 5 events that happened over a period of a year and a half, and you remember them as 2 events that happened almost at the same time. And one of the things that continually surprised me looking through the actual archive of journals and calendars and so on was that things that I thought happened at a particular moment actually happened over more than a year. So yeah, memory is fallible. And sometimes you would look at the record, and I would look at the record and I would think, no, but that's not what happened.
arguing with your archive.
Memory is this strange thing that even when memory is confronted with the proof of its wrongness, it still insists on being true. Even before the archive thing, I remember when I was writing Midnight's Children, there's a passage in there about a period when India briefly went to war with China, and it was about where the border on the Himalaya mountains should be, and anyway, there was this war, and and the Chinese army was clearly doing much better in it than the Indian army, and people in India got very frightened, and this is, after all, not so long after the end of the British Empire. I mean, it's only 15 years after it, 16 years. And people began to worry about whether there was now going to be a Chinese empire, et cetera. Anyway, I remembered this sense of panic in India. And then when I talked to my parents about it, my mother said, "Don't be stupid, you weren't here, you were at boarding school in England." And I said, "No, I wasn't." I said, I remember you saying and Dad saying it, this and that, And they said, "No, you weren't here. It was term time. You were at boarding school in England." So then I look up the dates. They're right. I wasn't there. And all of this has to do with what they had told me about it. And I had, from my memory of them telling me about it, I had constructed a memory of being there. And even now, I know it's wrong. I still think I was there. So memory has those problems, and it was, in many cases, really more than surprising. I mean, really shocking sometimes to realize that my own record, my own diaries and journals of what had happened, was so at odds with my memory of those things. And I mean, interesting.
Liz?
So in that you did write through the period of using typewriters into computers into whatever's next.
Yeah.
Did how the digital side of your collection was processed change who you envisioned as the types of researchers and the types of people that might use this collection?
Well, I had a general fear about the tabloid press, just because I thought there's going to be people who are going to come rummaging around looking for scandal, and there's been a bit of scandal in my life, so it's possible they could find some, and I didn't particularly want to help them in that process, that was one of the things that we had to be very careful about, what would somebody who was really maliciously inclined, not somebody approaching this from a scholarly point of view, but somebody looking to make headlines. What would they be able to use? And that it made me very wary of that. And I mean, I'm wary of that in general, but when you're opening an archive, you have to be extra wary of that. Other than that, no. I mean, in a way, I think you have to, at least I find I have to, in a way, block out the fact that people are going to be looking at it. I mean, I can't afford to think that what I'm doing is a public act while I'm doing it. Because I think one of the strange things about writing a book is that when you're doing it, it feels like a very private act. You know, I mean, you're sitting in a room by yourself for a number of years, quite often. You know, and really nobody else is seeing what you do. You know, nobody else knows what you're doing, or you know, and you know, months and years pass often without your showing it to anyone. You know, so you feel that you're doing something very intimate and personal and private and for yourself. You know, and it's an illusion, of course. You know, because the work is intended for publication. But at the time of doing it, it feels like this. It feels like nobody else is there. You know. And then you publish it, it becomes a public act, and it's always a little shocking. I think, you know, the moment of publication is always a little bit of a shock when the thing that has been so intimate and sealed away from everyone else is just out there in the broad light of day. You know? But I still think in order to do the work, you have to create the illusion of that private space, you know, for yourself. You can't have the sense that there's 100 people looking over your shoulder now because it's going to end up at Emory and you know, they're going to come and read it. And so I think I find that I have to arrange with myself not to think about that. You know, and also, you know, I mean, I'm not sure when I'm going to send any more stuff here. You know, I mean, like the stuff that's here is up to about, what, 92, 93, what is it?
Oh, no, we have digital material to up to the point of acquisition.
Oh, no, you do, which is 2005,
2005, I think.
Is it as late as that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, well, that's all right. Well, that's a.
Sorry to tell you that.
No. No, I forgot exactly what it was up to. Well, they've still got 7 years that you don't know about.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, I mean, eventually it'll end up here, but I think, you know, there's no plan for it to go anywhere else. It'd be ridiculous for it to go anywhere else. But when, I mean, it may not be until I'm 110 years old. You know, so I can pretend to myself that you're not going to see it anytime soon. So,
fair enough.
And it is important to have that sense of private space, I think.
Yeah.
You know, because the work requires it.
Maybe one more question. Yeah, Ben?
There's been a time during your life and your career when you've had to be more careful about being public about your location and your doings and comings and goings. I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on how you kept records differently and what records you might have kept differently during those time periods in contrast to times when you've been able to be more public.
Okay, well, it's a good question. Well, one of the things Erika and I were just saying, that one of the reasons why I ended up having all these old computers, as opposed to having trashed them somewhere, you know, is that it was that during this period of kind of high security and so on, we didn't want to get rid of the computers, you know, because there's stuff on them, and even if you clean them, you know, who knows? And so they ended up being in closets instead of being thrown away, and as a result, they were available to, you know, so that the number of machines that were still in my possession was a direct consequence of those years of caution, you know. So that's one thing. In general, that was a time when you couldn't say anything about anything, you know. So I didn't want people to know anything about my movements or, you know, places of residence or whatever it might be. And I'm still quite cautious about not wanting people, but that's for different reasons. That's just for paparazzi reasons, not wanting people to have too much access to private information. But it gave me a habit of that caution, really, you know, and because it went on for a long time. It was more than a decade, you know, so you get into the way of it. And I think, well, again, one of the things we had to be careful of in this whole process of making the archive available is not to compromise security issues, you know, and it's not so much for me anymore as that the fact is that there's certain ways in which security is done, you know, and it may well be that it would need to be done for other people, you know, and you don't particularly want to tell people all those tricks of the trade, you know. I mean, you tell people some of them, because some of them are not like maximum security. I can tell you how to know if you're being followed when you're driving a car. It's different if you're driving in a city to if you're driving on a freeway. If you're driving on a freeway, what you do is you deliberately, crazily vary your speed. You sometimes drive very, very fast, and you sometimes go into the slow lane and drive really, really slowly. And it's just illogical and nuts. And if anybody else is doing it, they're following you. Another thing you do is when there's an exit coming, you get into the exit lane and drive at very high speed. And then the person following you, if there is such a person, doesn't know if you're going to leave at that exit or not, so they have to come at you at the same speed. So if there's another car behaving as badly as you, it's following you. So things like that. That does, I mean, there's of course much more sophisticated material that you don't want to. In cities, it's just that silly stuff, you know, go round roundabouts 3 times, turn across the street with the traffic a lot. If somebody else is doing it, they're following you, you know. So it's not, I mean, a lot of this is just commonsensical. It's just basically you drive badly. And if somebody else is driving badly in the same way, it's not an accident. So, anyway, sorry, don't know why we got there, but
Just never know what you're going to learn. Well, I want to thank you so much for sharing your time with us and your observations and your archive.
Thank you.
And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.